One of the figures whose name is meaningful to all of the people that I serve and who should always be mentioned in the context of studies of President Kennedy's assassination, among other things, is a great man named Professor Peter Dale Scott. And Professor Scott is an extraordinary figure in a couple of ways. He's a poet, he's a translator of poetry, he's a former diplomat, he's a professor emeritus of English at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's responsible for works of consequence which have influenced the direction of people such as the speakers who are with us here today. And Professor Scott is generous with his time and influential with regard to his understanding. And I want to share with you something that you can investigate by visiting one of my websites, which is aarclibrary.org. That's the Assassination Archives and Research Center.org, where you'll find a number of menu pages to choose from on the left-hand side. And one of those most recent additions to those pages is a transcript of, well, not really a transcript, but something relevant to an audio excerpt, a conversation that I shared with Professor Scott last December of 2017. And we were talking, as is so often the case, we were talking about the identity of Lee Harvey Oswald, because there are lots of places you can go where you will learn lots of things that are not true. And we want to try to invest in the necessary places with the necessary discipline to be cautious and careful and try to make sense of things that are sometimes contradictory and sometimes confusing. But we also want to challenge ourselves not simply to embrace what we want to be true or what we think is inevitably true, something that we all know, when in fact we don't. And the story might be more complicated than we realize. And in this particular case, Professor Scott said to me during the course of a 35-40-minute conversation, he says, "Now you and I agree that Oswald was an asset." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "But then you go a step beyond where I go and you say he was an agency asset." And I said, and then I probably said something about, well, you know, I'm concerned about problems with the records inside the agency for a period of 4 years between October of 1959 and October of 1963. As Malcolm Blunt would be quick to assure us, aberrations in protocol, abnormalities in terms of the dissemination of Oswald-related materials, things that draw attention to themselves because they're not the way it's supposed to be. And Professor Scott said that there are times when he does not think that Oswald was a CIA asset. And this is the beginning of a much longer conversation, because there are lots of different ways that a person, especially a military figure, can be utilized by a federal agency as a pawn, wittingly, unwittingly, innumerable different ways that professionals understand, which most of us certainly would not, because we're not professionals, most of us. Professionals understand their profession better than non-professionals. So I had this exchange with Professor Scott. He said to me, "Do you remember my reference to industrial security and a figure named Richard Ronstadt?" And Richard Ronstadt was a Cold Warrior military figure from the 40s who posed as a leftist and found employment through security companies, which then reported to the FBI. And the substance of this particular piece to which I'm referring may be found by going to aarclibrary.org, aarclibrary.org, and simply searching for Professor Peter Dale Scott Speaks with Alan Dale about Robert Ronstadt, Industrial Security, and LHO. And I'm hopeful that some of you, I know my friend Robert certainly will, because you're writing it down right now. I hope some of you will take the time to take a look at this, because he wants us to know, he wants me to know, there are many ways for a person to be an asset. There are different ways of thinking of Oswald as an asset. For an ultimate resource, something to carry with you for a decade and to deal with for a decade, Professor Scott's original work from the 90s, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, has inspired some of our most inspiring scholars. From Dr. Newman and his extraordinary and important work to Bill Simpich and State Secret, certainly Jeff Morley and innumerable others who probably would say to you in all humility that we are where we are because Professor Scott illuminated a path for us. And that's not an overstatement. At this time, I have the honor of introducing really one of our featured speakers. He was a career strategic intelligence cryptologic analyst for the United States Army. He served 2 years as the executive military assistant to the director of the National Security Agency, General William Odom. And he is a figure whom I think of personally as not merely a teacher and a scholar and a researcher and a mentor, but also as a successor, properly, a successor to Professor Scott. His work, beginning with 1991, the publication of a book called JFK in Vietnam, changed the way serious historians deal with the subject of President Kennedy and the era in which he lived. The result of which, it had two profound consequences. The first was good. The first was that former DCI Director of Central Intelligence William Colby approached Dr. Newman, volunteered to participate in trying to help draw attention to this important publication. The second, in the same vein, was that former Special Assistant to President Kennedy, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., without solicitation, and without the knowledge that William Colby had done exactly the same thing, wrote a review for the New York Times Review of Books that was favorable to help draw attention to this important work by this important scholar. The part that was consequential, that was extremely destructive, was that after 5 months, Warner Books pulled the book. And you could no longer purchase this book that had generated very significant international attention. It even played, there's a lot that could be said about JFK in Vietnam, not least of which is that with the encouragement of certain essential administrative and research assistants, like J. Harvey and myself, and Sue Newman, Dr. Newman realized during the course of his present work, which is a 5 or 6 volume series on the life and times and death of our 35th president, he realized that it was time to go back 25 years and to review the work of JFK in Vietnam. The result of which was JFK in Vietnam, the second edition, published in January of 2017. We are pleased to that as of late December of this year, we are confident that Volume 3 in his continuing series, which is called Into the Storm, will be published. The manuscript is complete. It's being finely tuned like a Guarnerius violin. And we're hopeful that everyone with I would say with a serious interest in coming to terms not just with who killed President Kennedy and why, but really coming to a deeper and a better understanding, a more richly and accurately informed understanding of what was the nature of the national security state during the period of 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days where this extraordinary young man was our nation's chief executive. Because that story has not been well told. and it is being told through the work of our distinguished speaker. I'm asked to also mention that in a departure from usual protocol, that at the end of the presentation, Dr. Newman will indulge in a little bit of speculation, a special treat. He will talk about the assassination cover-up, and he will make specific reference with regard to the context of his program this evening to the defamation of Robert F. Kennedy and what it really tells us about how the perpetrators of the most consequential assassination of the 20th century, how they got away with the crime. It's my honor to introduce Dr. John Newman.
Good evening. Thank you, Deborah, JFK Lancer, for inviting me to come. Again, I wouldn't have missed it. It's my understanding this is the last hurrah, maybe. Oh, good. Well, that'll be good. All right, in any event, I did come last year and present on Antonio Veciana and also on something I call KGB CIA Spy Wars. Those were all chapters in Volume 3. And I've been working diligently since then on a number of other things. And one of them is the story of Sam Halpern, a CIA officer who spent about 35 years defaming Robert Kennedy. And I've just finished that work recently, so what I'm about to give you is brand new, consolidated from 4 chapters down into something smaller that I've never even dry runned before. So we go live with brand new material. That's Sam Halpern, late in his life. He wasn't doing too well at that time. He died in 2005 of dementia. And I'll actually be mentioning that at some point tonight. That ended up being part of the problem along the way. Sam Halpern had an interesting background. Before 1961, he spent several years in the CIA Tokyo station. Interestingly, and was transferred to the agency's Cuban operations in the post-Bay of Pigs wasteland after the Bay of Pigs, and just about everybody that was anybody got fired. In October of '61, he was assigned as the deputy chief of the Cuban desk, WH4, and in early '62, he became a special assistant and then later the executive assistant to William Harvey, the chief of the new Cuban component called Task Force W. Harvey and Halpern worked on the CIA's part of Operation Mongoose, a program to overthrow Castro, headed by Attorney General Robert Kennedy and General Edward Lansdale. Halpern retired in 1974 and served on the board of directors of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, AFIO, created by David Phillips. Until 1980, he served on that board from 1984 until his death in 2005. The AFIO obituary for Halpern lauded his career and his uncanny recall with this memorial. Many of us had his number on speed dial as questions arose, needing his precision and his uncanny recall. His willingness in his retirement years to assist so many organizations, authors, researchers, and journalists leaves an immense gap in our institutional memory. Halpern corrected many misperceptions about the role CI officers played in covert actions, showing that most were done at the behest of the White House. For example, that Robert Kennedy put the CIA under pressure to arrange the assassination of Castro. That was his tombstone, on his tombstone by AFIO. The most important thing he ever did in his life. Halpern hated the Kennedy brothers. This is from an interview with Ralph Weber in 1987, one of many examples. The brothers were gadflies. In my humble opinion, they couldn't care less about the United States of America and what it stood for. They were interested in one thing only, and that was clearing the blemish on the Kennedy coat of arms. And I will tomorrow have a chance to talk to you about a few of the good things that Kennedy did that are missing from this characterization of Kennedy. It was as if they did nothing at all good for our country. Anyway, that's the way he felt about the Kennedy brothers. I'm going to move now to something I call the White House pressures ploy. You can't read this, it's not necessary. I only put it up there because it's like blood on an autopsy report. It's from real documents, and I retyped them so that you can see them. What it is, it was discovered by the Church Committee. It's a few pages from what was an early draft of the CIA Inspector General's report, with which many of you are probably familiar.
1967.
Yeah, 1967 IG report, preliminary draft. So what this says, this is the actually opening sentence of this early draft, that early in the Kennedy administration, the White House, and it's interesting they put quotation marks around that, I didn't, urged Richard Bissell, he was the deputy director for plans, the covert side of the CIA at the time, urged Richard Bissell to create an executive action capability, i.e. a general standby capability to carry out assassinations. The executive action program became known as ZR Rifle. Let's go over that one more time. About the time that Kennedy was inaugurated, the end of, actually early February, end of January 1961 was when the president ordered what became ZR Rifle, became called ZR Rifle, an assassination program to be created in the CIA. Many of you, or some of you out there, should be actually having a bad reaction to that. Okay, the program originated about the time of the nominating conventions in 1960. Richard Bissell was the one who designed it, and he actually lied about it afterwards and said it was Edwards in the security office or somebody else. But it's very clear that Richard Bissell himself was the one whose idea it was to hire the mob for the job, and it goes back to about August of 1960. It turns out the source of what I just showed you, the source of the story that President Kennedy ordered the creation of the assassination program, the CIA, in January of '61, is Bissell. He is the source of that. He told Harvey that he had been twice asked in late January or early February. This is actually from Harvey's deposition, one of his many depositions to the the Church Committee. He said, in late January, early February, although my memory is somewhat later than that, in 1961, on more than one or on two occasions, the White House had been quite insistent that to him, Bissell, that the agency develop a capability for executive action. Under oath, Bissell recalled telling Harvey about this White House order to activate the assassination program. But in that same deposition, on 6 times, he admitted he had no recollection whatsoever of ever having been told by anybody in the White House. So how do you square that circle? He's a lawyer from Yale. He doesn't want to be caught perjuring himself. So the truth is that he did tell Harvey that Kennedy had ordered that program, but the truth is also that Kennedy never told him to do it. I'm going to get to his motive in a second, but so the Church Committee was well aware of the long history of the CIA mafia plot that had been going on for 6 months before this happened. And so they began to bore him and ask him questions that he couldn't answer, obviously. And so then he would say, well, then would ask him, well, who told you? And he said, well, was it Rostow? Or no, was it McGeorge Bundy? Well, they ended up pulling them in and deposing them too. And of course they said, no, we didn't tell him that. And then they had them call each other. And there were lots of phone calls, and there were probably about 8 or 9 or 10 depositions by the time they got through with everybody, at the end of which Bissell admitted, you know what, I think that the agency is the one that created it themselves. He didn't say I did, which was the truth, but basically he retracted the whole story. What was his motive? He was in line to replace Dulles as the DCI. Kennedy promised him that he would succeed Dulles in July 1961. But the problem was that the Bay of Pigs was his operation. And the Bay of Pigs at that time, during the inauguration and after the inauguration, was in deep trouble, as you know. It was failing. The primary people, Esterline and the paramilitary chief, had tendered their resignations, and he needed a Hail Mary. And his Hail Mary was to get Castro dead. And maybe that would change not the complexion of what was going on in Cuba, but maybe it would change the complexion of what Kennedy was willing to do. He refused and told everybody he would not send combat troops into Cuba. And maybe, just maybe, with Harvey dead, that might change the equation. We can't really be sure what was all the things going on in his mind. All we know is that he was not going to succeed Allen Dulles at the CIA if the Bay of Pigs failed miserably as it did. And that really was the end of his career when it did fail. That's what I think his motives were. But to get to our story this evening, around about the time of the church committee, Sam Halpern got involved, and I have a lot more to say to you about his involvement with the church committee and what happened, but that was the first time Sam Halpern ever saw the ZR rifle documents. And he saw what I showed you. He saw the story that Bissell told Harvey about Kennedy ordering an executive action program established in the CIA. Now, Halpern was very familiar with the interim report, alleged assassination plots to kill foreign leaders. He read everything that was that the committee released in late 1975 and early 1976. So he knew what the real story was. But he liked that. He liked the story that the Kennedys had ordered this. And it became the cornerstone of his 35-year defamation of RFK. It became the cornerstone. They were the ones who came up with the idea and implemented this program to kill Castro. I'm a little ahead of my skis here. We'll just skip ahead. Yeah, that's Halpern under oath. He didn't lie under oath. In fact, when he was under oath and asked a question, his answers were short, but set him down with a couple of CIA friends in a long interview, one question asked, and about 3 pages of stream of consciousness. Hopping from here to there in his brain, you need a psychiatrist to pull it apart, but in there's a lot of truth, and I'll have some things to show you by the time we get to the end of this briefing about that. So when did it start? When did Halpern's story begin? It began in interviews by Scott Breckinridge, who was the Deputy Inspector General of the CIA. And that would have been in the spring of 1967, leading up to the publication of the IG report in that spring. And the funny thing is that Scott Breckinridge, who was actually the principal author, one of the authors, but probably the principal author, didn't put Halpern's remarks about the RFK plan into the IG report. He waited until 1993 when he published his book. And there's where we learn what he told Breckinridge back in 1967. Breckinridge referred to what he learned from Halpern and his associate, Goshen Zogby, another officer in WH4, as a footnote on the Cuban affair. Breckinridge said that among the initiatives emanating from Mongoose in 1962 was one arising from a theory entertained by Bobby Kennedy, that the criminal syndicate, the mafia, must have channels into Cuba to protect such remaining assets as they might have there, and the CIA was directed to provide an operations officer to meet with mafia figures identified by Kennedy under circumstances over which the CIA had no control. Okay, so this is Breckinridge discussing what Halpern had said. It wasn't easy or comfortable for CIA operations officers to carry out unprofessionally conceived, clandestine activities run by a young man who spoke for the president as few, if any, could. The Attorney General's initiative involving the syndicate is interesting. For some, it will suggest the genesis of the CIA's decision to approach the syndicate again in its plan against Castro during the Kennedy administration. I'll decrypt that and put that into English for you. The idea was that after the Bay of Pigs, the CIA mafia plot was dropped, and at some point it was reactivated. So here Breckinridge is saying, you know, some people will think maybe the Kennedys were restarting the CIA mafia plot again. In any event, I've only had a minute or two to talk about what's in Breckinridge's book, but when you read more of the details of it, what is obvious is that the story developed. So the question, when did it all start? Well, the 67 IG report is only 3 years after, you know, a little more than 3 years after the assassination. And as an already fully developed hypothesis, which didn't include assassination just quite yet, by the way, we could back it up pretty close to the assassination. We just don't know. The first record is 1967, as told in a 1993 book by Breckinridge. It's time to move on to the next section of my presentation. It concerns the time period of the Church Committee and Halpern's role. He played a very important role at that time. The Church Committee also the Rockefeller Commission were created because Cy Hirsch authored a couple of page one banner headline stories in 1974, I believe. One of them was on the overthrow of Chilean President Allende, and the other was on CIA domestic operations. Big banner headlines, and that precipitated these inquiries, congressional inquiries into the CIA's activities. So what happened was a lot of former senior officers like Helms, former DCI Helms, and other senior officers from counterintelligence and elsewhere had to be pulled out of retirement and brought to before the Church Committee to testify. And so they had to establish a staff at the CIA, a review staff, to service the requests of the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee. And of course, the Church Committee had its own staff of lawyers who didn't know that much about the case that had to be brought up to speed. And so in order to prepare people like Dick Helms for his testimony, in order to prepare the staff of the Church Committee, they needed somebody. He was at the social events where the Church Committee staff and the review staff at the CIA getting ready for this big shindig with the Church Committee, and the wives put together, you know, dinners and social events, and this is one of the major ones that occurred, and this is Sam Halpern talking about the dinner party, and in particular, I was the target of the night. obviously, before dinner and after dinner, and everything else. And I said, you are going to be surprised at the fact that you are not going to find very much paper around. And the guy said, don't you guys ever put anything in writing? And I said, we can, but if we can avoid it, no. And the whole purpose was to try and get me, I suppose, to tell them how to find things or what to look for. And that's really what was going on. He was telling the staff what it was they should be looking for. And of course, when it came time to brief Richard Helms, he told Helms what to say. That Helms and the big boys didn't know all the poop. They just knew the general situation, and I was the one who had to give them the poop. And so when it came time to depose Helms, just leave that. Yeah, just leave it there. Thank you. What took place was very interesting. So they had heard this story, probably from Halpern, I can't prove that, but probably from Halpern, that Bobby Kennedy had asked Helms personally to provide a case officer to be the contact with the mob in his plan to kill Castro. So they asked Helms about that on the witness stand. And there's the question. Isn't it true, Mr. Helms, that RFK had himself indicated he desired contact with the mafia source? Hadn't he put out a search for mafia people that might be of help? Helms said, he suggested we look at the underworld figures. I'm not sure exactly how this came up. Well, if he told it to you personally, you would know that, wouldn't you? At one time, a case officer was assigned to check in New York, Chicago, and places like that for any underworld figures who had ties in Cuba. And he said, some of these facts, I think you want to run them, if you want to run them down, his recollection is much better than mine. You might try Mr. Halpern. Or some of the people who were intimately involved in the day-to-day work of this task force who are still alive. I mean, Harvey is one, but maybe someone from the staff to talk to. And Senator Baker, which Halpern is this? It's Sam Halpern. Nobody known to you. Let's go to the next one, please. So for RFK's request, a CIA case officer began a search for the underworld mafia contacts. Helms, underworld contacts, I'm not sure they were mafia or not. Schwartz says, what was the name of the case officer? Helms, I don't know. The reason is Halpern gave it to me when we chatted about this. And he was laughing. The guy's name is Charles Ford, actually, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the point is, and what the takeaway from this testimony for the church committee, is that whatever Helms knew about an RFK request for a case officer to contact the mafia did not come from Robert Kennedy. It came from a little chat that he had with Sam Halpern. Not Robert Kennedy. I'm going to skip over something here just to save a little time. At some point after this, Walter Elder, who was an assistant to Colby, the DCI at the time, wrote 2 memoranda based upon 2 of the staffers that I mentioned that were at those dinner parties. And they said in documents that, in fact, RFK had asked Dick Helms to provide this case officer, Charles Ford. And that wasn't true. They hadn't been at Helms' testimony. They didn't know about the chat. They didn't know this. But the point is that there were 2 pieces of paper, one of which actually said that, and later on, people who wrote books and were interested in Halpern's story would use that piece of paper as proof that Bobby Kennedy had asked Dick Helms to provide this case officer, whereas he had not. And Ford himself, under oath, completely denied that story. But Nevertheless, it's a piece of paper, and if you're interested in establishing this RFK Mafia myth, that's a piece of paper you're going to be talking about a lot, not the ones that show the other side of the story, which is the truth. I just want to, if we can go to, here we go, okay. So what you're looking at here, what I'm trying to establish here is that Sam Halpern knew everything that the church committee published, especially the stuff about himself. He really liked that the best when they talked about him. But he spent a lot of time reading it, and what you have here, it would take me a long time to read them, are about just more than a dozen examples that I picked of of things that he quoted directly from the interim report. Subject you can imagine. So what that tells us is how closely he read it. He was aware of all the stuff, including the CIA mafia plot, including that his boss, William Harvey, was the one who was doing that, and that was a very, very big surprise for him. He did not know until the church committee did its work that his own boss, Bill Harvey, was doing the very thing that he accused Bobby Kennedy of doing. Running an operation, a secret operation to assassinate Fidel Castro. I want to preface this section of my presentation with this information. Halpern was eventually interviewed by lots of authors. The one that's most worrisome is Cy Hirsch in Dark Side of Camelot. And because Cy Hirsch was interested in defaming the Kennedy brothers, Sam Halpern was interested in him, and they were interested in each other. They were really made for each other. One of the biggest lies that Halpern told was that Bobby Kennedy, he told this to Cy Hirsch, and Cy Hirsch put it in his book, that RFK ordered Ford, who he was sending to all of these mafia contacts all across the United States, to conceal his reports to Robert Kennedy about what he had found out, talking to all these mafia types. And so that the result was that not one word was ever published about what Ford learned on his missions for Bobby Kennedy from his mafia contacts, and were not shared with his bosses. That'd be William Harvey and the people above William Harvey in Task Force W and in the DDP. And so the problem with that is that Robert Kennedy did call Charles Ford, and he did call the CIA, and he did ask Charles Ford to do things for him, and we have the record of it. Charles Ford did write the records of what he found out when he talked to Cubans that RFK asked him to, and they were shared with his bosses. In fact, he wrote them, and we'll go over a couple of them. Right here is a list of all the types of people that read the reports that Ford wrote about the things that he did for Bobby Kennedy. They included the DCI, they included the deputy DCI, they included Task Force Chief Harvey, his deputy Chief Cheever, and Sam Halpern. Included senior officers in the Sea Office of Security, they're supporting the Security Analysis Group, Physical Security Division, and other security components. It included senior officers in the CIA Directorate of Administration and several officers from the CIA Miami JM Wave Station. That's a lot of people who are reading all the reports that Ford wrote about the work he did for Bobby Kennedy that allegedly don't exist. And if we go to the 62, there it is. You can't read all that because there's too many of them. Those are all the reports that Hal Ford wrote, and when he wrote them and to who he wrote them, about the work he did for Robert Kennedy on the missions that Kennedy asked him to go. And I'll be going into a couple of details of those in a second. In fact, we'll do that now. Let's go to 63. Good. One of those operations was what we call, or I call, the Exile Prisoners Project. A memorandum contained in the file dated 30 March 1962 indicates that Ford issued, was was issued a alias documentation card for a Charles D. Fiscalini, and it was assigned to Task Force W to travel to New York to meet with an unidentified attorney who had contacted Robert Kennedy concerning assistance for Cuban prisoners that had been involved in the Bay of Pigs. Let's go to 64. A client who had access to Cuba and wanted to visit Castro to put in special word on behalf of these Bay of Pigs prisoners. This is Ford writing, and this is actually his testimony, sworn testimony to the church committee. I identified the individual concerned as a manager of the Teresa Hotel in New York. I identified a man I met at a second meeting named Bubbles Abdullah, and I explained to the DOJ investigators, that would be Bobby Kennedy's guys, that I had no further contact with these people after I discovered that Bubbles was wanted under indictment by Texas for smuggling drugs from Mexico. Anyway, that was one of the things that Bobby called up and asked for somebody to run some errands for him, and Ford was the guy, and so that's had nothing to do with the mafia or assassinating Castro, but this is what was really going on, and Halpern knew everything about it. In late September 1962, the assistant administrator of the economic branch of the Organization of American States, Ernesto Betancourt, personally met with Robert Kennedy with a request for American help. Considered a moderate anti-Castro Cuban, Betancourt was advocating support for the Ejército Libertador de Cuba, we'll just say ELC, a group planning an uprising in Santiago province at the end of the month, September 62. The ELC was a military organization, and its members included former soldiers of Batista's regular army and Castro's rebel army that had fought against Batista. In 1962, this moderate coalition was the kind of anti-Castro group that interested President Kennedy and his soon-to-be chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Maxwell Taylor. Now I'll let the actual cable traffic tell the stories. We'll go to 65. At the request of GP Focus, that would be the crypt for Robert Kennedy, on 24 September, I then, Ford, met Ernesto Betancourt in ZR Metal, that would be the crypt for Washington, the front man for the ELC on 25 September. Because Robert Kennedy said Betancourt did not want to contact the CIA, that would be Kubark, the I then, that would be Ford, used the name Don Barton. Unfortunately for Halpern, he thinks that he used the Fiscalini alias here, and he didn't. That was used back in March. In September, in this operation, he used Don Barton. So that was a mistake that Halpern made. But interestingly, I found the Don Barton name used elsewhere, believe it or not, one time by David Atlee Phillips a little bit earlier. Yeah. So just one of those things, you know, it's fun. It's not known whether these ELC men were aware of Bobby Kennedy's interest. And we'll go to 66. Late afternoon of 28 September, Robert Kennedy phoned Ford and strongly suggested arranging Guantanamo base, that's Y.O. Acre, meeting to see what plan is. The Ford immediately phoned Betancourt, who said to make contact with Eduardo Perez, his crypt was AM Denim 11, in Miami to convey decision to Guantanamo for the feasibility of a meeting, but only for discussion with no implied prior U.S. commitment. Complicating factor about this case, in addition to Bobby Kennedy's interest, or prior interest by GP Ideal, that would be President Kennedy, and GP Photo, that would be General Taylor. All this stuff is in a big cable going to JM Wave from headquarters. And if we can go to 66A, go back to 66A. You can't really see it here, but can you see whose signature is down here in the bottom? Sam Halpern. Yeah, he read it. He read the whole thing. And this was the biggest one, and actually the biggest operation that Ford did for him. And Ford drafted it, and Sam Halpern was the authenticator at the bottom of the cable. So this whole story about we didn't have one piece of paper of any operation that Ford did for RFK is a complete lie. By this time, though, by the time we are past past the church committee, and we're on into the 80s, and I'll take you through some of the interviews he did with the CIA then. He's beyond the help. Do you all remember the Dr. Seuss books when you were a kid? One of my favorite ones was The Day on Mulberry Street, not Green Eggs and Ham. I liked The Day on Mulberry Street. That story was a little boy went out one morning to the street, and there was a street sweeper there, and he had a garbage can and a broom. By the time he got home and told Mommy what happened that day, it was the greatest show on earth. There were 5 bands playing and all kinds of stuff happening. And as you turned each page of the book, which was the fun thing if you were a kid, something else was added to the parade. And so I call this Halpern's Christmas tree. He put a new bauble on the Christmas tree every few months as his story grew and grew and grew. Until eventually he couldn't remember what was in the story because he died of dementia in the end. And it's a very weird story. If you spend the time, like I did, 4 months, day and night, pulling this thing apart into its fine pieces. Let's go to the next one, please. 67. I think we'll skip over that. That's more of these cables. And AM Denim 1, certain we can expect assassination attempt on AM Thug 1, that's Fidel, AM Lout 1, that's Raul Castro, AM Quack 1, that's Che Guevara, which would trigger revolt. Anyway, what happened was they said, no, you can't do this, this is stupid, you guys are going to get killed, you can't have this uprising. And so they told him, don't do it. And so they quashed an attempt to assassinate Castro. They weren't for it, they were actually said, no, don't do that. So this whole idea that Halpern had Ford running around for RFK trying to assassinate Castro using the mafia is just so out to lunch. It bears no resemblance at all to the true record, which was lying in the open there, since, 25 years ago. And Hirsch didn't bother to read any of this stuff. It's crazy. He didn't read any of the depositions from the Church Committee report. He just took Sam Halpern's word and put it all in the Dark Side of Camelot, and there it was. And you go look at his notes, and it's all Sam Halpern and a couple of things out of Breckenridge's book, and there's not one document, none. And so Cy Hirsch, I focus on him. There's a lot of other people, some of them we know, researchers that we know personally over the years that have written some crazy stuff about this, but they didn't have the influence and the reach of Cy Hirsch. So I'm a little more concerned about Cy Hirsch's book than Gus Rousseau's and stuff like that. In the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next section. We're going to be going to the sevens. Okay, we can stop there. I told you I would do this. I did it before with the specific examples of Halpern actually quoting from it, but these are the kinds of things that he was aware of that are very important. And I'll read from my page here what's on the screen. He was aware of the FBI, Department of Justice, RFK, and JFK knowledge of Sam Giancana, Roselli roles, and CIA plots to assassinate Castro. Halpern knew all about Harvey's testimony to the special group. Halpern knew all about how Harvey had brought Helms into the picture about this secret CIA mafia plot and the recruitment and the use of Roselli. Halpern was aware of Harvey's passing the poison pills to Roselli. Harvey was aware of Roselli's church committee depositions. He was aware of the provision of intelligence on Cuba. He was aware of the use of Roselli and how it could later lead to an embarrassing blow if it came out. And he was aware of a lot more things. So he knew all these things that were going on with his boss. And let's go to 72. And he was aware of this, that in May 1962, he was told by Houston, who was the IG at the time, and Edwards, who was the head of security, that this is when RFK found out about the CIA mafia plot due to the Las Vegas wiretap incident with Giancana. I don't have the time to go into that whole story, but yeah, they backed into that one, and by finding out about that story, found out about the whole long-running, by that time, well over a year and a half, the CIA mafia plot. And RFK hit the ceiling and said, you won't do anything with the mafia before you ever, you will not, until you come to me and ask for my permission. He got very, very angry with them. And so they said, no worry, boss, it's over. We stopped the program. It is no longer happening. And that was a lie. That it went on, and Edwards told Houston RFK was never told of the continuing involvement with the gangster elements. So it continued. Let's go to the 73. What we have going on here is Harvey is continuing to do something against the orders of the Attorney General and behind his back. And Halpern knows it. Helms testified about this too. Harvey, the reason we really know about this, Harvey said, well, okay, let me back up. What happened was Edwards, the security office chief, wrote the memo saying that Harvey said that the program was over. And that wasn't true. That was a lie. Harvey never said any such thing. And so when they deposed Harvey, said, Edwards put that in there, and he did it to create a false record, to take them off the hook. And here's Helms testifying about it. He couldn't explain the, quote, fun and games, unquote, by CIA officers to create fiction about stopping the mafia plot. So, 74, please. Halpern knew that at the time of the 7 May 62 briefing for RFK, Harvey had just been introduced to Chicago mobster Roselli. Halpern knew that Harvey had overseen the provision of the lethal pills, arms, and related support equipment for the mafia. And Halpern knew that RFK believed he'd received a commitment from the CIA that they would comply with his order to inform him before any future activity took place. The principal recorded interviews detailing Halpern's fiction about a secret RFK plot using Charles Ford to facilitate a mafia assassination of Castro spans the years from 1967 to 1998. And after that, let's go to, this is 81. Okay, after that, Halpern served as a consultant for several projects and researchers, although the dementia from which he died in 2005 had already become a factor. He was 83 when he died. The 1967 starting point, Halpern's interviews with the Deputy IG Scott Breckinridge, of these, mostly recorded CIA interviews, was probably not the birth of his RFK Mafia myth, although 1967 was certainly not the beginning of his hatred for the Kennedy brothers. Halpern's experiences during the 1974 and 75 Church Committee activities were, from the standpoint of his evolving RFK medley, a mixed bag. Initially, Halpern was riding high during the creation of the committee staff and the CIA review staff in support of the committee and the crucial testimony of former DCI Helms. However, the publication of the committee's findings, especially the interim report, Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders, came as a great shock. His discovery that his own boss, William Harvey, was doing the very thing he was accusing Bobby Kennedy of made for tough sledding during the 3 key CI interviews by Weber in 1987, McAuliffe in 1988, and Littell and Warner during 1978. Sandwiched in between those interviews were his interviews with Cy Hirsch. We'll go to 82, please. Throughout all those interviews, Halpern avoided what undermined his RFK fiction and continued to add new embellishments. Perhaps the key embellishment was the addition of the assassination to the RFK equation, and it occurred during the Church Committee period. Under oath, Halpern denied assassination was included. That was the truth, because it wasn't. However, slide 83, please, Senator Church had already gotten wind that privately Halpern expressed the opposite view. Assassination was definitely included, and it was definitely included by 1998. As you can see from that quote right there, to Littell and Warner. I agree that people who think that the assassination was involved, because I can't imagine Bobby on his own would be doing that kind of thing without telling Brother Jack. I think they were so close together. So Bobby and Jack were both in on this plot to use the mafia to kill Castro. Let's go to 83A. Our favorite investigative journalist. Like it or not, Hirsch's works are part of the landscape on a number of subjects of interest in the body politic, including Vietnam, the Middle East, and the presidency of Kennedy. In my view, The Dark Side of Camelot is one of Hirsch's poorest performances over the course of his career in journalism. Halpern coveted every opportunity to spread his fictional RFK account to historians and journalists and documentarians. So Cy Hirsch's Dark Side of Camelot presented a golden opportunity. Halpern was only too happy to add Hirsch's journalistic reputation to his vita by cooperating with Hirsch's endeavor to depict the dark side of John Kennedy and his brother Robert. Without bothering to check the available record, Hirsch bear-hugged Halpern's endorsement of the thesis that it was JFK who created the executive action program at the CIA and added his own loving touch. This is Hirsch now. There was talk of murder in the White House. Let's go to 84. But as this slide shows, Hirsch was all in. Kennedy, increasingly impatient with the lack of progress in Cuba, decided in the early spring of 1962 to run his own operation. He once again moved into the back channel as he had done with the Soviets, this time working with the Mafia. On his orders, an experienced clandestine CIA operative named Charles Ford was assigned as the Attorney General's personal agent. Kennedy's unprecedented request went up the chain from General Marshall Carter to the new CIA Deputy Director for approval. I will take a time out to say that that is an interesting chain of internal knowledge of this. And it's a true one that was used in the ELC operation that I briefed you on earlier. Here, Halpern is actually appropriating that footprint and using it on an operation that never occurred. Clever guy. Slide 85. Halpern and Hirsch even found a way to rationalize both Harvey and Bobby working with the Mafia, but at cross purposes. So RFK's primary purpose with Ford was to do what Harvey wasn't doing, find someone to assassinate Fidel Castro. Very interesting, right? Because Harvey hasn't succeeded in killing him. Now he's saying, well, Harvey's not doing a good enough job, so Bobby went and found to do it instead. Charlie saw Kennedy in his office and, of course, talked to him on the phone and quite regularly. Charlie was a good officer and Bobby was his case officer. Charlie never reported that kind of information to me. I think he was sore about that. He may never have reported it to anybody. He was Bobby's man. Let's go to 86. But by this time, Halpern's confused state of mind was already in evidence. Halpern obviously told Hirsch that the RFK Ford plot was in play all the way up to the JFK assassination, as it says here on this slide. By 1998, Halpern would say it ended with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Nothing in the documentary record on U.S. anti-Castro activities is more upsetting to Halpern's RFK Mafia myth than the history of Harvey's administration of the CIA Mafia plot to assassinate Castro. Harvey was also Halpern's direct supervisor. Halpern claims Harvey never told him about the plot. Asked by Weber in '87 about CIA assassinations, Halpern's response descended into a stream of disorganized discourse. He was still suffering from the damaging effects of new experience learned from the interim report from the Church Committee as he blurted this out. We'll go to slide 87. No, because I was involved with one. Some of the others that I had known about, yeah, sure, it wasn't in my area, so I wasn't involved. I didn't know. The one I was involved in was the one against Castro, one of the ones against Castro. I do not know about the use of the Mafia by Bill Harvey. I have no idea, for example, that Bill Harvey was mucking around with Roselli of the Mafia, but Bill knew how to keep a secret, and even though I was his executive, I had no idea. And I know his deputy had no idea at all. Now, until a psychiatrist examines this schizophrenic reply, the following observation will have to suffice. Two separate assassination attempts are entangled in this answer. First, Halpern mentions an older recollection, the 1963 CIA plot to assassinate Castro using Rolando Cabela, M. Lash. the operation he had been involved in and had talked about many times. Yet in a split second, that older safe memory was overwhelmed by awareness of a disturbing newer memory, a plot that wasn't in my area. I wasn't involved. Then, like a butterfly, his awareness jumps back to the first attempt that he had been a part of, the 1963 abortive plot. Then, once again, just as quickly, the disturbing obscure experience resurfaces, and as it did so, the cat jumps out of the bag. It was the assassination plot in which his boss, Harvey, had used the mafia. That was the plot that had been bothering him, likely from the first moment he learned about it when he read the committee's interim report. We'll go to slide 88. The key is that, as Halpern told Weber, I wasn't the only one personally. But he never ended that sentence with Weber. Ending it would have looked something like this. I wasn't the only one who didn't know about Harvey's use of the mafia to assassinate Castro. And that is exactly the way he did complete that thought several weeks later during his interview with Mary McAuliffe, the deputy chief of the CIA's historical program at the time. We'll go to slide 89 to take a look at that. And there's the completed thought. Harvey's dealings with Roselli. Harvey's dealings with Roselli weren't known to anybody. Not to JM Wave Chief Shackley, not to Harvey's deputy Cheever. They were not known to me, Harvey's exec. The only one who knew that Harvey was in touch with Roselli was CIA Security Director Chef Edwards, but he would never know the details. Harvey wouldn't tell anybody a bloody thing, I'm sure. She asked him, McAuliffe, if all the assassination attempts really occurred under Desmond Fitzgerald in 1963. Not true, not true. The ones I knew about, there's only one, basically, the one I was directly involved in, the Amlash one. Then, the only under Harvey, Harvey being a good old bureau guy, kept his own counsel, and all of his dealings with Roselli were unknown to me and unknown to his deputy. The information about Edwards and the introduction of Harvey to Roselli was accurate, but Halpern could only have learned about that from the interim report. Clearly, the interim report was a startling and humbling experience for Halpern. Feeling left out of Harvey's big CIA mafia secret, Halpern consoled himself with the thought that he wasn't the only one left in the dark. Halpern made a big deal about the exclusivity of Bobby's use of Ford as the cutout to the mafia. And the one thing Ford did on a full-time basis, he says, is that what I have here? Let's go to 92. So we assigned a guy full-time, and he got the telephone calls from Bobby right out of what we called the bullpen, where we had several secretaries. And Charlie was always answering the phone and being called on the phone because his boss was calling, namely Bobby. And Charlie would say, guess I got to go make another trip. Let's go to 93. And Halpern knew and suppressed the truth that Ford himself revealed under oath. This is Ford under oath. My conviction was that the only concern of the committee was whether I was directed to sally forth and contact members of the underworld, and who directed me to do so. Their interest was even more pointedly focused on whether I had anything to do with the Roselli and Giancana operations. I was never directed to take the initiative in establishing contacts with the underworld, period. And he does go in this sworn statement of his into all the things that he did with Robert Kennedy as well. But none of them involve going to the mafia. 93. Taken together, the Weber and McAuliffe interviews firmly established that Halpern's original 1962 RFK mafia myth had been contrived in a state of surreal ignorance. The real CIA mafia plot, created all the way back in the summer of 1960, was still ongoing in 62, and Halpern didn't even know about it yet. I find it ridiculous that Halpern's boss, Harvey, knew nothing about a 1962 mafia assassination plot against Castro under Bobby's direction. At no time during his 3 depositions before the Church Committee did Harvey say one word about any RFK mafia plot. He hated Bobby and certainly would have mentioned it if it were true. And so let us imagine a scenario in which both mafia plots were true. Once again, we encounter ships passing each other in the night. Incredibly, Harvey was as ignorant about RFK's mafia plot as Halpern was ignorant about Harvey's mafia plot. No, Harvey was as ignorant about RFK's plot as Halpern was about Harvey's plot. Too many plots. It doesn't take a genius to realize that these two virtually identical mafia plots cannot both be true. There are not enough Johnny Rosellis to go around. By 1978, Halpern realized that still being confused about Harvey's use of Roselli was not an option. Halpern never mentioned the real CI mafia again in public. I believe it was in Dallas, Texas here, many years ago. We were doing a JFK event. I don't know whether it was one of yours or not, but I was on the dais, and sitting next to me was Judge Thunheim. And then when it came my turn to speak, I got up and I said that, I turned to him and I said, Judge, I'm about to engage in gross, highly speculative and irresponsible speculation. And he looked at me and he said, John, it's about time. And so I'm going to do that tonight and finish up with something I'm calling the JFK assassination, a taxonomy of the cover-up. Because you see, we all talk about the cover-up and we talk about different aspects of it, and people don't mean the same thing when they're talking, when they use the word cover-up or they use the word what is secret or what isn't secret, or so I found it, you know, Peter Scott is a guy that had a huge influence on me. I remember his phase 1, phase 2 dialectical cover-up model. And I believe I was talking to Alan Dale one night about that, and we decided that what I was talking about was a little bit different, but Peter had insisted that he really agreed with what I said, and so I thought, you know, it's time to sit down and really think about what do these words mean, and so I did that one morning after meditating for about 20 minutes on my yoga bolster, and came up with this, and I'm going to give you what is in what's in the book at the first of these 4 chapters early on about this, an attempt to create a taxonomy. The cover-up of the president's murder was carefully prepared well before the event itself. In the days immediately following the shooting in Dealey Plaza, both overt and covert components of the cover-up were put into play. Overt is what the public sees. Covert is what people with appropriate security clearances see. The overt component created a calming public spectacle by framing Oswald as a crazy lone nut with communist sympathies, but with no direct connection to a larger conspiracy. The covert component was just the opposite. It created a threatening, top-secret crisis by framing Oswald as a witting agent of an international communist conspiracy. The overt component was a messy but straightforward public exhibition of fabricated evidence in Dealey Plaza. The covert component was an intricate, secret, need-to-know exhibition of fabricated evidence in Oswald's top-secret government files. The fabricated top-secret evidence was weaponized to create a frightening impression of an impending crisis. The U.S. was facing a possible nuclear war with the USSR because the FBI and the CIA had failed to connect the dots in their secret files on Oswald. In this manner, our national security institutions were incentivized to cooperate in the unfolding cover-up. The symbiotic relationship of these false conspiracies in the overt and covert components of the cover-up was an ingenious fit. The calming effect of the lone nut non-conspiratorial overt scenario, itself, of course, part of a true conspiracy, was the antidote for the false conspiratorial crisis scenario unfolding inside the government. The key to the long-term success of the cover-up was the continuing survival of the covert component of the plan. As long as the covert communist conspiratorial scenario remained viable, the feasibility of the overt lone nut, apparently non-conspiratorial component became less important over time. The importance of the role that these discrete conspiracies played in the hierarchy of false conspiracies cannot be overemphasized. In the long run, it didn't matter how many holes were poked in the Dealey Plaza scenario, and you know all of them. The cover-up of the true conspiracy, the Wizard of Oz cabal behind the curtain, was dependent on a continuing staunch defense all the way up to the present day of the crucial covertly engineered false conspiracy, the RFK Mafia myth. The permanence of that covert false conspiracy permitted the dismissal of the less important fabricated evidence in Dealey Plaza as a benign conspiracy to save America. In a nutshell, this was the plan. An international communist conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy was the result of the Kennedy brothers' collusion in a plan to assassinate Fidel Castro. The key element in the plan was this ominous false scenario. Robert Kennedy got his brother killed and almost started World War III. A secret RFK Mafia plot to assassinate Castro was turned around by Fidel and, with an assist by the KGB, used to assassinate President Kennedy instead. The alleged involvement of the Kennedy brothers' collusion in Castro assassination plotting is the indispensable and inseparable foundation for the false international communist conspiracy scenario. To prevent the deaths of 40 million Americans in a thermonuclear war, the apparent Castro-Kremlin role in the Kennedy assassination had to be suppressed by Chief Justice Earl Warren at the secret level, and I've documented that. He went on TV, WTA in Washington, and told the whole story of Johnson telling him about World War III and how he cried. He didn't say cried. LBJ said he cried. And he said, "Boss, you know, if you put it that way, I guess I'll have to take the job." Today, this permits the CIA to characterize that suppression by the Warren Commission as a benign but necessary conspiracy to save us all. Therefore, as these complicated components of the hierarchy of false conspiracies evolved over the last 50 years, it's not at all surprising that the Kennedy brothers' alleged participation in Castro assassination plotting has become even more important than the issue of whether the manufactured evidence in Dealey Plaza points to conspiracy. They've given up on that. So in recent years, a peculiar new paradigm of benign conspiracy has emerged. You know who they are. Besides the usual suspects, Shannon and others. That paradigm goes something like this. If the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy, then the Kennedy brothers were themselves to blame. And so today, many mainstream observers, researchers, and authors have become inescapably attracted to the view that a Kennedy involvement in Castro assassination plots is the reason President Kennedy was assassinated. And the tethering of Bobby Kennedy to that make-believe mafia plot was the handiwork of CIA staff officer Sam Halpern. The history of that preposterous lie that RFK was behind a CIA mafia plot to kill Castro is one of the least understood and most successful deception campaigns ever conducted by a CIA staff officer. The importance of Halpern's work is former intelligence officers as they singled out his blaming of RFK for the mafia scheme as a shining example of Halpern's lifetime of accomplishments. However, the Castro assassination Kennedy collusion subterfuge brought with it an element of risk. Baking Kennedy collusion into Castro assumption plotting left this otherwise cunning cover-up with an Achilles heel. The demonstrably false RFK narrative had to be left in the open. Do you believe it? If you don't, you take it away and the role of both brothers vanishes with it. And the nakedness of the emperor is exposed. The light of truth illuminates one of the worst disasters ever to befall the American Republic. And that's why I have devoted 4 chapters to Halpern's handiwork in Volume 3. I would like to quote General James Gavin, the commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division in World War II. He said, quote, "Let us not lay on the dead the blame for our own failures." Thank you. I'll take a couple of questions now. If we have several of them, I'll hang around, and later on when the other presenters are here, we'll have time for some more. It's an RFK night, by the way. The next presentations are also going to be about Africa. Yes, sir.
Hey, John, got a question for you. So you're demolishing the RFK mafia plot myth. Okay, granted. Do you think the Kennedy brothers, either Robert Kennedy or John Kennedy, or both or separately, were encouraging the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro without using the mafia? I mean, the reason I say that is because Operation Mongoose, which was run by Robert Kennedy, that wasn't exactly giving Fidel Castro ice cream and cookies, was it?
Okay, I have an entire chapter on Mongoose in Volume 3. And the bottom line is, from the very get-go, President Kennedy made one thing clear: no combat troops. Okay, no combat troops at all. And never, ever did assassination come up, or was it ever presented to Bobby Kennedy or the president. Not once. So there's not a record of them even being asked to do it. Here's what I want to say, and then I'll take your question, ma'am. What they did do was to bang on the heads of their subordinates to overthrow Castro. And that was a bad mistake. They did that because they felt humiliated at the Bay of Pigs. They should have left Castro alone. And in the first instance, what they were doing was carrying out a holdover plan that wasn't theirs from Eisenhower. But when the Bay of Pigs failed, and then they had to deal with things like Berlin, a nuclear issue in '61, and Laos, and a bunch of other things in Vietnam. Once they ran the table of all these other huge problems, they got back to the business of taking care of Castro, and they walked right into it again. And they were very sorry for having done that, because what happens is, and I don't have time to deal with this during my presentation here tonight or on this visit, but they ran into something called Operation Northwoods, and a huge fight between Lemnitzer and President Kennedy. Okay, and it ends up very badly in Vietnam in '63. So they've got a long ways to go. But volume 3 turned into 2 volumes. So I don't have a concluding chapter for this volume. I just have an intermission. Okay, we are going to war. Even though we were able to stop it, they were able to stop it in Cuba in fall of '62. War was coming. Your question, yes, ma'am.
I'm curious why Cy Hirsch chose to believe him, Halpern, versus any other independent type of investigation.
Correct. Hirsch didn't bother to check the other investigations unless they agreed with Halpern, and the only one he did was Breckinridge. But there were many other things he could have looked at, including the documents and all the depositions of all the people involved. He looked at none of them. Because he had an agenda to defame the Kennedys. Look at the title of the book.
Why did he have an agenda?
I don't know. You know, I'm not a psychiatrist, but Hirsch, that's what he wanted to do. Yes, go ahead.
John, two-part question here about Castro and the CIA. Do you think elements in the CIA wanted to kill Castro the day before the Bay of Pigs? And following up on that, do you think they ever seriously wanted to kill Castro?
Okay, they certainly did in the Eisenhower administration. We know that. Now, as we move forward into the Kennedy administration, it gets interesting. The majority of people still want to do that. They want to kill him. They don't want to just overthrow Castro. They want to kill him. But there's a small number of people who end up pretending that they're doing that, but they don't want to do that. Because think about it. If the plan is that Castro kills Kennedy, Castro has to be alive, not dead. So when you're looking for the bad guys, and I'm looking, and I'm coming up on volume 4 and 5, just give me some time. What we're looking for is that small group of people that can control the operation and make sure that we never give Kubela a rifle with a telescopic sight. We'll give him some other stuff, some plastic and a few other things. We will not give him what he wants to do to actually kill Castro. So it's a complicated story, Bill, and I'm just now starting to get my arms around it, so don't hold me to it. I may change my mind tomorrow when I start Volume 4. Yes, sir.
On the morning that Kennedy was killed, Kennedy's emissary, John D'Angelo, was meeting with Castro and for coexistence, peaceful coexistence. So he did. So he had already met with the band. It was a Cuban Missile Crisis. He had turned for peace, and that was one reason why he was killed. Because Johnson was the one.
You asking me a question? I know you think that. Is there a question somewhere in there for me? Okay, that's like you said. The question is, you think. I know, but are you asking me what I think? Are you asking me if I agree with that, or I don't understand? Okay, here's my answer. I'm not there yet. I'm still back in '62. I'm serious. That's not. It may sound like a joke, but I pulled the tablecloth and all the dishes off the table. I'm going back and starting all over again. Everything's off the table, or everything's on the table. Let me put it that way. Yes, sir.
Hey, John, a question about who do you think actually wrote Operation Northwoods? I had a researcher tell me, hey, I think maybe General Edward Lansdale actually wrote the text for it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, like I said, I have a whole chapter on this. A whole chapter. The very, very interesting story here. Okay, Lemnitzer was behind. This is the last question, okay? And I'll take more questions later on. We got Larry's coming up here, and Carmine's coming up here to talk about some things. We want to get them up here and get their stuff started. So here's what Lemnitzer did. Lansdale was the guy that President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy chose. He was their guy. And if you've read JFK in Vietnam very closely, you'll know that back in 1961, a guy by the name of Ed Lansdale, who was an unconventional warfare guy, threw his lot in with the conventional war people because he knew that was the star rising on the horizon and he wanted to be there. He threw in his lot with the chiefs who wanted war in Vietnam and wanted war in Laos back then. And what happened in the spring of '62 is Lansdale actually writes, not Northwoods, but he writes essentially the same thing. Tasks 33C, A, B, C, and D out of 33 tasks were in fact what Northwoods looks like. And the idea was that Lemnitzer wanted to use the Kennedy guy to make the argument. And the Kennedys took countermeasures and clipped Lansdale's wings and forced the snake to come out of the grass, forced Lemnitzer out into the open. And they knocked heads in a meeting that is, we don't even have but a handwritten note about what happened between the two. And it wasn't pretty.
Who knocked it?
Lemnitzer and Kennedy were fighting over war in Vietnam and Cuba at the same time in the spring of 1962. That's a good question, and I'm done for now. Thank you very much.
Thank Dr. Newman.